Hello everyone, welcome to Data Engineering Studies. In the Azure Real-Time Scenarios playlist, we are going to see an interesting Azure use case. The scope of this use case is dynamically ingest data from Azure SQL Server to Azure Storage account using Azure Synapse Analytics Pipeline. Our source is Azure SQL Server, which has a set of tables. Our objective is to dynamically load this data into the Azure Storage account. Assume that on day 1 we have two tables in the Azure SQL Server and we are loading the data from both the tables to the Azure Storage account. On day 2 we got three tables in the Azure SQL Server. We should be able to load the data from all the three tables to the Azure Storage account. On day 3, if you would like to load only the data from the first table and the second table, the data from these two tables should be loaded to the Azure Storage account. The user should have the flexibility to dynamically load the data from Azure SQL Server to Azure Storage account. I hope the scope of this use case is clear. Now let's get into the implementation. Here is my Synapse Analytics workspace. My source is dedicated SQL pool. I have three tables: cinema, population and subscription. I'm going to load the data from these three tables to the Azure Data Lake Gen 2. Here is my Data Lake Gen 2 storage account and here is the container. Currently my container is empty. Let's see the content of our table. In the cinema table we have different seat IDs and the details about if the seat is free or not. Next we have population table which has different states, city and their population count. And then we have subscription which has different customer ID and their subscription related information. We are going to load the data dynamically from the Azure SQL table to the Azure Data Lake Gen 2. Now let's create the pipeline. The first step is to create a new pipeline. Let me go to integrate and create a new pipeline. Let me name my pipeline as PL demo. First let's create a pipeline parameter to read the table names from the user. Let me click new and name my pipeline as list of tables. It is going to be of type array. Next, I am going to read the table names from the pipeline parameter and assign it to a variable. In order to do that, I am going to use a set variable activity. Set variable activity. And I am going to create a new variable. I am going to name my variable as v list of tables. This is also an array. Let me click confirm. The value of these variables are coming from the pipeline parameter. Let me select that. I have selected the pipeline parameter. Now let me click OK. Let's run our pipeline till this point and see our result. Let me publish my pipeline. The pipeline is successfully published. Now let me run my pipeline. Let me click add trigger and run my pipeline. I'm going to provide a list of tables, population, and my next table name is cinema. Now let me run my pipeline. Let's see the result. We see that in the values we have an array with the different values that we passed in the parameter. The next step is to iterate over these values and load the data from the SQL database to the Azure Data Lake Gen 2. In order to iterate over these values, I am going to use a for each activity. Let me go to the pipeline and import a for each activity. Now I am going to connect the set variable activity to the for each activity. The input of the for each activity should come from the set variable activity. In order to do that, let me go to the settings and go to items, and I am going to select the variable that we used in the set variable activity. Now let me click OK. Inside the for each activity, I am going to use a copy data activity. Why I am using a copy data activity? To copy the data from the SQL database to the Azure ADLS. In the source settings, let me create a data set. My source is Azure SQL DB. Let me select the Azure SQL Database. Here is the Azure SQL Database. Let me click Continue. I am going to name my data set as DS Source DB Demo. Now let me create a new linked service to connect to my database. Let me click New. I'm going to name my linked service as ls source db demo. My source tables are inside Azure, so I am using auto resolved integration runtime. Let me select my Azure subscription and my server name. Let me select my server name and my database name. By default, it will show only master. For now, I am going to select only the master database. Later on, I will change it. I am using SQL authentication. Let me provide my username and password for my dedicated SQL pool. Admin. And select my password. Let me test my connection. The connection is successful. Now let me create. The linked service is successfully created. For now, let me select a table name from my master database, and later on I will change it. Let me click OK. My data set is successfully created. Now let me go to my data set. For that, let me click Data and select Linked Integration Dataset and select my data set. We are not hard coding the table names. Instead, we are getting the table names from the parameter. In order to pass the table names from the parameter, let me create a new parameter. Let me name my parameter as P as in parameter table name. Now let me go to the connection. Instead of hard coding the table name, I am going to select Enter Manual, and here I am going to select the parameter. Now let me go to the linked service and change the database name. In order to do that, let me click Managed and select my linked service. Here is my linked service. I am going to change my database name. Let me test my connection again. The connection is successful. Let me click Apply. We have completed the source settings. Let me go to the pipeline again. Let me do the sync settings. Let me go to sync and create a new data set for the sync. My target is Azure Data Lake Gen 2. Let me select Azure Data Lake Gen 2. Here is Azure Data Lake Gen 2. Let me click Continue. Let me select the format as CSV. Let me click Continue. I'm going to name my data set as DS Target Demo. And I'm going to create a new linked service for the target. Let me click New. I'm going to name my linked service as ls target ADLS demo. Since ADLS is inside Azure, I'm going to select the integration runtime as auto-resolved integration runtime. Let me select my Azure subscription and select my storage account name and test my connection. My connection is successful. Let me click create. The linked service is successfully created, and in the file path I'm going to select my target container. Let me select my container and click OK. Let me click OK again. The source and the sync settings are successfully created. Let me publish and run my pipeline. I got an error that no value provided for the parameter p table name. Let's fix the error. Let me close it. The parameter p table name value should come from for each activity, because our copy activity is inside the for each activity, right? Let me select the for each activity and now click OK. Now let's publish the pipeline again. The pipeline is successfully published. Now let me run my pipeline. I'm going to provide an array of two table names, cinema, and the other table name is population. Now let me run my pipeline. The pipeline is running successfully. Here, two copy activities is called because we used two table names. Now let me go to the ADLS and see if the data is copied. Let me go to data and select linked service. Select my container. We see that the files are successfully copied from the database. Let me open one of the files and see if the data looks good. Let me download. The data is successfully copied. Now let me delete these files and run the pipeline with a different parameter. Let me delete. Let me go to my pipeline again. Now I'm going to run the pipeline with the parameter cinema and subscription. Now let me click OK. Let's see the pipeline run. Let me refresh. The pipeline ran successfully. Now let me go to the ADLS and see if the files are successfully copied. Let me go to data and click refresh. We see that now cinema and subscription files are successfully copied. We have created a pipeline which dynamically copies the data from the SQL database to the Azure Data Lake Gen 2. I hope you liked this use case, and I'm sure that you learned something new today. If you do like this video, please consider to subscribe, and I will see you in yet another interesting Azure use case. Thank you.